Welcome to this FutureTalk, Teaching Empathy. I'm Helena Pozniak. I'm an education journalist from the UK. Scientists say that everyone, apart from psychopaths, can learn to empathise. But empathy and other so-called soft skills are supposedly in short supply among our young people. So what's it like to be a different colour, a different sex, or to live among groups of people who might be shunned by wider society? Do we need to learn to stand in each other's shoes before we really understand the problems that some people around the world face? Is empathy essential for any meaningful change? Could we all be better at it? How can we learn it? And is virtual reality the right tool? I'd like to introduce my guests for this session. We've got Elise Ogle, a social scientist who worries about the psychological effects of virtual reality. She works at Stanford University's Virtual Human Interactive Lab, looking in particular at the power of VR to stoke empathy. Siddharth Prakash is a strong believer in using technology to improve education, especially across India, Middle East and Africa. He works at Microsoft Research, where colleagues are working with technologies such as HoloLens and haptics. And Cody Karutz, who you may have seen yesterday, a cognitive scientist who's also done time at Stanford's Virtual Human Interactive Lab. He's now an independent consultant and works with the likes of Facebook and other tech companies to look at issues surrounding virtual technology. So first up, guys, I'd like to ask you if you could all give me a definition of empathy.
Shall I? First off, thanks everyone for coming. I hope this will be a stimulating conversation. When we think about empathy and how to define it, when we create studies, we really want to have like a solid definition to be able to actually say whether or not something increases or decreases empathy. So we look at it as a mixture of two things. There's the cognitive aspect and the affective aspect. So when I feel empathy for someone, I can recognize that their emotions have changed and that they're feeling something. And then sometimes I also feel something different. My own emotions change. So it's a mixture of both, or it could be one or the other, but we really try to look at the different pathways to empathy.
For me, I feel, very generally speaking, empathy is something which, again, it's all about perspectives. And I feel that, it's probably the opposite of being selfish, because when you put yourself in somebody else's shoes and then start thinking that way, the world looks very different. So that's how, very generally speaking, I would like to define it.
Similar to Elise, as a cognitive psychologist, I would define empathy as imagining what it's like for someone else to experience something.
Okay. So business schools, I've heard reported that sometimes students define empathy as weakness. Is it a weakness too?
I think that when we talk about empathy, when we talk about weakness, what we're really talking about is good or bad. And I think that empathy does elicit both things. And so it's important to talk about situations where empathy might not be helpful. It could be a blocker for whatever reason. In medical professions as well, talk about interacting with the patient, and sometimes when being empathetic might not necessarily be the best thing in that moment to give the best amount of treatment. So I think that there are both sides to it.
Mm-hmm.
No, I agree with what Rudy said, because, again, there has to be a boundary, and I guess not everything, falls in that category where, actually you need to learn and, feel that way. So there needs to be a boundary, and that's something that, again, I guess is still an open problem, where you define the line, and once we are able to get there, probably, things will look much better.
Yeah, I think empathy it takes perspective taking. So like you are able to understand someone, and I think that shouldn't be considered a weakness. I think it's really a strength, especially when you work with teams or you work with other people. You need to understand where they're coming from, and I think that engages cooperation.
Okay. And do you think in today's hard-nosed society, are we empathetic enough generally?
If you ask me, I feel no. And I guess the reason I say this is because if you look at the increasing divide that's happening across the world, right? One of the reasons is that we, I think, are not, there as yet. So I'm sure there's scope to do more. And again, we can experience a lot of things socially and, get going that way. So.
I think in general, humans are not always great at what we call metacognition, which is thinking about our thinking. I think that as a species, we could do a lot more of that. Empathy or not, I mean, in a lot of contexts, I think that that just taking a step back and thinking about how we process our emotions and how we think about things is really what's going to provide us the most amount of benefit, is just examining our own behaviors and reflecting on why we do or don't do things. And so metacognition, I think, comes into play a lot here.
Sorry, Elise.
No, I agree.
They are very much in sync.
Yeah. So, with your backgrounds, what is your belief? So, what's the best way to learn it? Why can't we just learn it from understanding each other? What role does virtual reality play?
So everyone comes to the table with a different predisposition to empathy. So for some people, it's really simple and it's easy. It's like when you watch a movie and you're moved to crying almost every time, even though it's not something that should really make you cry. So some people are very empathic, some people not so much. And I think it really takes understanding your own predisposition and trying to challenge that. But also we find that in psychology you have this threshold where, like, if you feel too much, if it makes you feel emotion that is hard for you to deal with, you kind of shut off. So it's important that we recognize and we also study how different people empathize, and then we personally look at, my lab looks at using virtual reality as that intervention tool for people. And we're trying to find out more, who is this tool good for? Is it a good blanket tool? Is it for everyone? We don't know yet because we haven't run enough people through our studies to get a really good, full representative view of even just people in the US. So it's about finding out more about people's own individual characteristics and trying to create VR experiences to change that.
No, I kind of agree with you again that, learning from each other is obviously something that we should do, and we probably do as well, right? But I guess not everybody is as privileged. Not everybody actually gets exposed to a lot of things that you and I can see. And to give you an example, I was recently in Kenya at a refugee camp, and there's an organization I met recently, and they actually do a lot of stuff for education for kids in refugee camps. So they actually try to do reverse psychology by actually using VR as an experience to go and make kids at privileged schools experience how a life of a refugee kid looks like. The expected outcome was that these kids will actually think more for people who are in the refugee camps and so on. Surprisingly, it turned out the other way. So the kids at these privileged schools got really scared, and they said that they will never want to interact with kids in the refugee schools at all because they cannot relate to them. So I guess to her point as well, you have to very clearly figure out, there's a lot of research that needs to be done in terms of what is really that thing that you need to do, and especially we're talking about children here, right? So their minds are very subtle. So experiences that you want to create and you want to expose them to, again, needs a lot of bagging and research.
Yes, because Cody, you've talked about the dangers of using virtual reality to sort of help people empathise and how it can backfire, as Siddharth explained. Can you just talk us through what you believe by that?
Yeah. So when I talk about empathy and teaching it, I actually think the best way to teach it is to instead teach moral reasoning and ethics first, because I think that so my background is in environmental ethics, and so Elise and I actually worked together at Stanford on a bunch of conservation projects and used VR to look at how people can connect to different parts of the environment. And we ran a couple studies, one of which is here if you'd like to try the ocean acidification experience. But we did other experiments where we turned people into coral, and then they saw that their bodies had become coral and it crumbled and kind of an acidified way. And I think the complication is that, especially in conservation, that in order to determine value judgments on what's good or bad for the environment, if we don't teach through those things first, then I think a lot of the meaning is lost. So if we're not taking a step back and looking at how we actually go through moral reasoning and decide this is bad for a piece of coral and this is why, then I think that just empathizing with a piece of coral or any part of the environment can have positive benefits, but if we're not thinking through why those things happen and why I'm reasoning to say this is better or worse for an environment, I think that's the best way to go about it, because that brings a much kind of bigger picture, especially in conservation when there's a lot of differences between what's good for a specific animal versus a species versus an ecosystem. I think that in order to determine what is good and bad, we need to look at how we morally reason between judgments.
So
I'd like to talk a little bit more about embodiment, so this sense that you're talking about. We are running a couple studies now where we look at experiencing what it's like to become someone else from that person's body. So one of the experiences here is called Becoming Homeless, where we're looking at empathy towards the homeless, and you get the embodied sense of being in the environment. And something that we found in our studies is that the context is super important. So if you place someone in the body of someone else, and you don't give them enough of the story or something to follow, they can actually feel a little bit more different from that person by the end of the experience, which is not what you want them to do. Whereas if you go through a guided experience, you become accustomed to your body, and you experience something from inside that body, we find that we can actually use that to increase empathy. So it's really important that content creators, and like if you're using this technology, that you look at the content and you can kind of tell things that like you go through it and you're like, that didn't seem right. But it's super important to like mindfully consume the content that's available right now, especially for virtual reality.
are there any subjects that are off limits, do you think, for this kind of empathy training? I know I can see obvious applications in sort of sexism, racism. Is there anything that doesn't lend itself to virtual reality when you're trying to teach empathy?
I think any situation where it backfires to a point where then it is overly negative. I saw a recent, I think this came out the other week, when they were talking about, there was a VR school shooting training simulator that the government was starting to look at rolling out to certain schools. And I don't know, contexts like that I think can get a little intense. Like if you're using it in a situation where that the negative outcomes might overweigh it, I think then, yeah, it becomes much more complicated.
So I read there was an experiment, this sort of thing of trying to make people understand what it's like to be blind. And I think there was an example when someone sort of ripped off the, blindfold or headset or whatever and said, "Thank God I'm not blind," which was a total reversal of sort of the result that people were after. I mean, how can you regulate how the content is produced to stop that kind of reaction?
No, I think, as you said, right, I mean, content plays a very, very crucial role in how we are actually talking about VR. Given the context in education, again, I think it becomes even more sensitive and relevant. And I feel that, at least for children of that age across schools across the world, a lot of data says that the current generation is becoming more and more introvert. They do not go interact with people the way we used to as kids and so on. So I guess those are the kind of skills that you can probably use VR to train, because not everybody is skilled enough or social enough to actually go out on day one and do things on their own. So VR could be, again, a good way to actually expose these children of today to get those skills tomorrow.
I suppose my comment there would be, why VR? Why aren't the parents teaching their children this? Why do we need VR to do this? Why isn't that something that human beings can teach each other?
I mean, it definitely is something that I think is best done with face-to-face communication. We don't study this, but my personal feelings are that people are becoming more and more isolated from each other just from using technology. So it's almost ironic that we're sitting here talking about using a technology to connect to others. But this is the day and age, right? It's something maybe we don't have enough opportunity to do face-to-face communication, and we need to incorporate modern technology to try to teach these things. And also, there are some affordances of using virtual technology to do this. So for example, when I'm trying to teach someone how to do something, I'm standing there, I walk you through it, I'm here in person with you. But if I can't be there, We can go in virtual reality and I can teach it to you. We can meet up in a virtual environment where you can see an avatar of me and you feel social presence, so you feel like I'm actually there. So we can use VR to augment our current environment, our current situation, and I think that's where the power of it comes in, and that it's not always going to be isolating, and in fact, it can really help connect everyone.
Yeah, I would say if you don't need to use VR, don't. I think that like human emotions are powerful, face-to-face interaction is powerful. I think that there's a lot of really great social and emotional learning that happens face-to-face in empathy training programs that work super well. But there are some contexts where VR does work very well, and one of them is in environmental contexts. So when we're thinking about trying to think about other types of ecosystems, like working on ocean acidification, or being a piece of coral underwater is only something that could happen in virtual reality in terms of embodiment, in terms of actually. You're never really going to feel what it's like, because coral doesn't have a human brain, so it'll never be the same. But in terms of what we'd imagine you would need to understand some of those systems, and to maybe kind of have a takeaway where we reduce the psychological distance between me and this faraway thing that's the ocean that I maybe don't spend much time in. I think it's a great and effective tool for that, and that's what a lot of the research that we've done at Stanford shows, is that it does reduce that psychological distance between you and this seemingly faraway system.
But
No, go ahead. I was about to say that I come from a tech company, so I shouldn't be saying this, but our generation is such that we like to, put technology everywhere. So obviously, I mean, face-to-face communication and learning is the right way to do it. But in scenarios where you can't, as my other panelists said, I think VR could be a good way to do that. And there's a lot of work that's actually now happening around VR, because I guess the state of the art with VR in terms of hardware is actually quite there already, right? So there are a lot of people who are working on haptics, people who are working on a lot of things which actually make VR experiences even better. So in times to come, with VR, artificial intelligence, all of this coming together, I'm hoping that all of these VR systems become very adaptive, and your experiences will be different from mine, because what you probably would want to learn would be different from what I want to learn. So.
one thing, before we open up to questions, I'm sure some of you will have questions. I just wondered if the psychologists amongst you could unpick the difference between immersion and sort of real experiential learning. Because from where I see it, there's a danger that you could just be, you talk about taking you to places where you wouldn't go normally, whether you could just become a sort of VR tourist and not really take away from that. I don't know really, is it?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the context. I think in climate change, and I think in talking about using VR to go to a place, there's a lot of discussion around how do we avoid what's called disaster porn, which is that I don't quite have the context for this place that I'm going to, or there's not a level of understanding there, where I'm more of a voyeur in that environment. And I think going to a physical place and interacting with real people brings a social consequence to it, in that if I do something wrong here in Dubai, there's the consequence on the other end of that, and that if I'm traveling there virtually, if I'm in some type of experience where that's not necessarily the case, then that really changes my experience. And so if you look at the difference between immersive reality and real reality now, is that is my biggest problem with it, is that there still aren't really that many social consequences, and with that doesn't bring the same amount of sensitivity or respect that we would bring to a physical place.
I feel, so far, right? I mean, I guess VR has basically mostly been tried on adults, right? And again, for them, as Rudy was saying as well, right? Experiencing something that they cannot do otherwise is obviously a great way to do it. But I feel when, again, we're talking about education and in this context, I do not think there is enough data that basically says what will help a child learn versus, pick something that he shouldn't be picking up. So that's, again, to me, an open question, and I guess the research community is actually looking at that. But then again, I don't know, because it's probably, the way learning happens in the East is very different from the West, and so on. So there are so many other questions which are, on the periphery that needs to be answered first. And once probably we do that, hopefully, it will be more applicable to education.
Do you think it's too soon to start bringing it into classrooms and that?
Curated experiences today, probably yes, but I don't think we are ready for mainstream, is what I believe.
I don't think enough mainstream content actually exists. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's anyone really creating content that is driven by curriculum, and the projects that we work on are usually grant funded, so we get a grant to create something to study some aspect of learning or empathy, and we work with like an interdisciplinary team to create this product, and we really want to make sure it's scientifically accurate, like ocean acidification, and it goes through all these like checks before we actually release it. And I feel like there's too much of a focus right now maybe on entertainment, where you're trying to put out content because there's not content available, and then the content that's out there is going to be like your first-person shooter games or like something that's really stimulating and like not educational. It's just going to be like entertaining, and so there's still going to be some time before that happens. But it's great to start thinking about that now, obviously, and like know that you need to work with people to actually make it right, and work with teachers and people who actually know what works and what doesn't work in a classroom.
Yeah, I think in the artist community, so you have two kind of levels right now. You have in the art community, those that are kind of pioneering some of the new content that's coming out. The problem is we haven't really pedagogically validated any of that yet to use it quite in a classroom. We were just talking about this before the panel, and that I did a couple meta-analyses recently, and there's very little, especially at the high school level, there's very little that's actually used current generation VR hardware and validated as a learning tool that's effective. And so we have all these great things that are being pushed out. VR won its first Oscar last year, and so like in the art community, it's definitely rapidly developing. But as like a pedagogical tool and as a teaching tool, we're still really not sure if it's like the best way to teach some things. And it's hard because the hardware keeps changing. It's like every 6 months, like a tech company will release a new device, and so we're trying to play catch up on the research side.
Would you mind just, we're slightly off topic here, but just sort of keeping us up to date on what the sort of latest research is on the effect of the sort of, talked about the shooter games, for instance, what's happening in young people's minds with the sort of proliferation of those games?
I'm not sure if anyone is really looking at the negative effects that video games, virtual reality video games are having on people. If you know like traditional literature about like video game on a computer, there's evidence that the more video games you play, if you play violent video games, it can show it correlates with increased aggression in the real world. So there's definitely concern, and I think it's important to be like mindful of the content that we're consuming, but no one's really studying it right now.
Apologies. Okay.
Yeah, and on the research side, I think, it kind of comes down to what I just said, is that it's hard sometimes for the research community to keep up with what the tech companies are doing and also what the artist communities are doing. I think that like Elise says, a lot of the funding comes from grants, and it takes a while. Like we have a JLS paper. Like, when is that coming out? Like, I worked on that in 2015, and it still hasn't been published yet. And it has some really great stuff in there, and like we would love to talk about it. And it's just the cycles for some of that academic pedagogical work just takes a while. But that study is really cool. Are there things that you want to talk about it, Annalise, the JLS paper? One thing, so Lisa and I worked together on some ocean acidification and using it as a teaching tool. And we found that, for example, so there's a 360 video, which is a type of VR that's a little bit less interactive than fully interactive, where you move around and you can grab things and interact. And so there's these kind of different schools of content right now, and there's a lot of debate over like which one is better and which one's more realistic. And so we did a cool study about ocean acidification and education tool, and we found that both together helped, where it's like live action 360 is really good, and then fully interactive like CG VR is good, but them together is the best, which seems intuitive, but that hadn't really been validated before because those things were so brand new. It was like 360 video had just come out, interactive VR had been out for a bit. I mean, we've been using game engines for a long time, but no one had really validated that, and those two things together were the most powerful as a teaching tool.
So, the problem is really the sort of snail's pace of academia versus the speed of the industry, and that, how can teachers know when it's ready? How do publishers know what the sort of value of it is, I guess?
So I guess there's like a big disconnect as well in addition to what you just said, right? Because, industry works in isolation. Academia obviously is, concerned about the quality of teaching and so on. I guess time is now right because, as I said earlier, I think we are quite mature in terms of hardware and, how you can deliver VR experiences. But creating content is something that, again, a tech company cannot do or even researchers cannot do. And that's where this community of teachers, have to kind of come forth and help work with researchers and technical communities to actually land that content and then actually validate that on ground. Because again, as I said, one size fits all probably may not apply. So you really need to validate what actually works, what doesn't work, and then actually take it mainstream. Yeah. So if you ask me, I guess now is the time to do that because we're talking about 2030. So we still have some time and, it will take a lot of effort. But again, I think we have to do it. So.
I want them to work with the art community too. I think it would be amazing to take the content that we're now creating and be able to do some research behind it. I think when Elise and I went to Tribeca with one of our pieces a few years ago, it was the first time ever that research data had been collected at an informal location like that. Most research is done in the lab in an experimental setting, and that had never really been done as like collect data at a film festival. Like the artist community doesn't ever do that, and so we got their permission somehow to let us do it. So we were like collecting data, and for us it takes a long time to collect 1,000 participants worth of data, but we did it in like 5 days. And so those two communities working together, like I think that can definitely bring some great things.
But in an educational setting, you'd need guinea pigs, wouldn't you? I guess.
Yeah, you need educators on board, and I've talked to a few here, which has been really great. So,
right, that's probably a good time to open up for any questions. I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand. We've got a microphone travelling. You just want to introduce yourself first, thanks.
Hi, I'm Olivier Uli. I'm a neuroscientist and president of Emotive. I got a question. You've been talking about validating technology, but content matters when we learn. Technology changing is irrelevant. It's what kind of content can you create that adds value? And the problem is maybe to call this reality. Look at the gaming industry. For years, the gaming industry has been trying to recreate how hair are moving perfectly in the wind. And suddenly Nintendo throws Y with very simplistic characters to which people engage a lot more than very realistic ones. And the point here was that technology didn't matter. Biological motion mattered. How the brains of people were reacting mattered. And the one thing that education is missing at the moment is what every other industry is doing, which is getting behavioral and brain insights in order to create content. As to what you refer to as validation, it's a very vague concept because validation will be basically confirming your hypothesis and your biased hypothesis as a scientist. I'm a scientist myself, I'm super biased. And well, what I'm telling now is just my very partial and biased opinion as a scientist, but who cares? And the question is, what kind of content can you create that is not yet available? If it's just to recreate something and to magnify it in 360, I don't see the point. If there are things you can't achieve with a book, with a tablet, with a teacher that VR will be able to achieve, that is the real added value at the moment.
So when we run studies, when we create studies, we don't just run things in VR. We're really looking to compare types of media. So like books to television to virtual reality, and we think about this sense of presence and how it differs across these different medium. If you think about a real life experience that you've had that has impacted you so much that it's changed who you are today, and then think about like if you had just written what had happened to you down and given it to someone to read and to think about. If you could give them an experience, and this is what our studies find, is that virtual reality is more similar to a real life experience than other types of media. So if you can give them an experience in VR, you can change the way that they think or the way that they behave. So I think it's really comparing VR to what exists out there right now, and all our studies find that it's closer to a real life experience than other types of media. That's just like a response.
Yeah, and to Lisa's point, in the lab we try to get control conditions, but you're right in the sense that if there is no control condition because you're doing something impossible, like there were some pieces in Sundance this year where you like travel space, like we're not gonna be able to validate that, like there's no control condition for that. And so you're right in that like we can't always validate if we're creating impossible experiences, which is the idea of virtual reality, to make you do something you can't do in the real world. Then you're right, yeah, it's then impossible to then validate those real things. So, but I guess as researchers, we try to get close, or we do what we can to do that.
Okay, I think we had a question from over here.
Thank you very much for your insights, but I was just wondering, much as we discussed the importance of research in this field of teaching empathy, I was wondering if we really need to wait for research, to start teaching something as fundamental as human feelings and empathy and emotions in classrooms. Do we really need to have tools and treat it like some other STEM subject that need to be taught in classrooms? Can't we integrate it with the existing curriculum in the manner of teaching students how to feel? That's something very, very basic that we have started learning or we have been endowed with. So do we really need research? Do we really need to think of children as guinea pigs and human beings as guinea pigs to be taught to empathize? I don't understand.
Should it be embedded, I guess? Right. Yeah.
So, no, I agree with you. We don't really need to wait for, do more research in terms of VR as such. But I think the point we're trying to make here is that there's a lot of research that needs to be done around content itself. Because, I'm guessing as an educator, you would probably know some parts of things which are very applicable even today. But then the example I gave in Kenya, where, the entire experience backfired. So, when it comes to children of that age, we have to be very, very careful in terms of the kind of content we expose them to. And that's where, I guess, even today, we do not have enough data to actually go and 100% guarantee that this experience that somebody creates is going to impact a kid in this way or that way. So I guess less from a technology standpoint, but more from a content standpoint and from what really needs to be given to students.
I would say no, we don't need to wait. I think that the experimental component of it is wide open, and I think that the only thing that you'd want to consider is just risks. I think in the United States, we talk a lot now about censorship of media, and video games have now been protected under freedom of speech, so we can't censor them. But there's a lot of talk now about does VR fit into that, and is it something that if it's similar to a real experience, is it more powerful and thus is it more dangerous? And then how do we need to treat that in terms of content recommendation guidelines? So I would look at what type of thing are you designing, how are you using it? And in the lab, we worked with Sesame Workshop at Sesame Street and looking at very young children. What are the age guidelines that we can also say what is appropriate for this technology? Because Sesame Workshop is traditionally one that provides content recommendations to parents, and they don't know how to recommend against VR yet. And so understanding kind of what is safe is not really been determined yet. So I think those things are important. But in terms of like experimenting in the classroom, I say go for it. I think it's great.
Okay, another question over here.
Hi, my name is Polly Fistolera, and I'm the founder of Social and Emotional Intelligence Institute in Bulgaria. So my question is, because I designed courses and I designed the exercise, the experience, but they are like real. If we go to the homeless, I just put them there, or I blind them, or I cover their ears and maybe don't talk, which is experience physical with the others, between the others. So because I like the VR, I would like to know what is the advantage to do the VR instead the real experience. Thank you.
So when we think about the content that we create in the lab, we think that virtual reality is really good for things that are dangerous to do in the real world, impossible for some people to do in the real world, counterproductive, or expensive. So if you have the ability, let's say you're learning about the environment and you're learning about ocean acidification. If you have the ability to go to the aquarium in real life and learn about fish and sea life there, like I think that is the best way to really connect to the environment. Or like you said, when you learn about homelessness, you actually meet like homeless people, or you go down to a shelter and you volunteer. I think that real life experience is the most powerful. But if you don't have the option or the ability or access to that, then virtual reality could be an intervention tool. We ran a study where we were looking at trying to get people to reduce their non-recycled paper consumption. And so if you want to teach them about deforestation, you probably don't want to take them into a forest and have them cut down a tree. But you could do that in VR. You can connect them to the consequences of their environmental actions by giving them that visual, the experience of cutting down the tree that represents their non-recycled paper consumption. And that would be a good use case for VR. So I don't think VR is good for everything. It's for very specific experiences that are designed to supplement curriculum in some way. But if you have the ability to do that real life experience, I think that is the best, and that is what should be done.
The mic on? Yeah. Hi, my name's Sean Bellamy. I work in a very small school where emotional intelligence is considered as important as anything else on the curriculum. One of our guys came back from a lucid dream, and he said, I was flying over a forest that was burning, and I woke up and it was real, and I just wonder whether virtual reality, he said, is just feeling like it's a controlled lucid dream. And therefore it's no more dangerous than those dreams which we sometimes find which move us as emotionally as if we've experienced them in the real world. Where's the difference?
So I actually grew up with night terrors. So I've had vivid dreams my entire life. And when I was young, they were to the point where they were debilitating back in the real world. So I had to get treatment to actually learn how to reduce them. And so I think that they do carry, a similar, or they can carry a similar type of effect. And sometimes, that can be negative. And so if your lucid dream content is positive and nice, and you're flying over, and enjoying it, then that's good. But I think in the same way, VR can be powerful too. Nightmares can be terrifying. It's anyone that's had a nightmare.
VR or no VR.
VR, no VR. It's
I mean, I think the difference is also you can control VR content, can't you? You can't control a dream. And that's also the danger, isn't it, of virtual reality content, is it can be tightly controlled, for good or bad.
No, I think, a lot of this content that we see on virtual reality, right, it stays in your subconscious mind. And, obviously that in a way, obviously comes in your dreams and so on. So you're right. You have to be very, very cautious with the kind of content you expose people to. And again, VR or no VR, I guess, nightmares are obviously always awful. So
I have a question for you guys, or a comment, so to speak, is that it seems like as you guys talk and you hear some of the crowd, you're looking at a collision course of feelings with test tubes, right? Is really the kind of the visual that you get is like, how do you collide these two things together? How do you take feelings and collide it into a research study, or how do you take feelings and collide it into a test tube or in a controlled area? But what we know about empathy, though, is that it can sometimes be the response to trauma, right? And it can also be, you can also be born with it, it looks like. You can develop it, but at the same time, in response to the resilience of a student or of an adult, they have this empathetic or lack of empathy response. So tell me how the VR experience is going to recreate trauma. And because there's systemic desensitization, right? See it over and over and over again until it goes away. Sort of like going to the top of the Empire State Building and you're not scared, but you can't go to the top to a second-story floor, right? Because you're freaked out and you're against the glass. So how does that all connect those things together? How does it connect the resilience models, which could be you're born with or you're not, or you're developed, and there's still arguments about that, and then also whether or not that empathy can be developed or brought down or ratcheted back through VR.
I mean, this is when I would say that context is super important. One of the successful applications of VR is for the treatment of phobias through systematic desensitization, because like you said, you're exposed to something and it's not as it doesn't impact you as much. You're not as afraid of it. It's also used for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. So specifically with soldiers who are experiencing this, you can use a system. There's a researcher at University of Southern California. His name's Skip Rizzo, and he studies PTSD and using VR to help rehabilitate people. So you have to expose them to what traumatized them and walk through it with a therapist. I think it's something that content creators really need to keep in mind, is that they do have the ability, they could traumatize someone based on how the person's predisposition, right? It's like maybe they've gone through an experience, like a lot of people are talking about using VR to help educate people about sexual assaults. But imagine if you had been sexually assaulted and you went through this experience. So I think it's really important that we have these conversations as content creators, and just start to think about too, like as we create content guidelines, there should be some sort of disclaimer. It's like, if you've gone through this, then don't do this VR experience, and you don't know about someone's background. I can't like look at you and say like, you've gone through this in your lifetime. So it really comes down to, I think, just being aware of what the content is and what you're getting yourself into before you try something, especially now, because there's like so much content out there that is kind of just floating around, but no one's really looked at it. That's a great question, though.
Oh, this one.
Yeah, on the topic of content creation, the thing I'm thinking about the most in these conversations is who controls the narrative. And at this point, we talked about that artists are controlling the narrative through games, and we through science and creating these 360 experiences for students. But moving forward, as these platforms become more open for even students to create their own experiences, what do you think about that, the field of narratives that are created?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I work with a lot of high school students. So Facebook is a big program where we put VR into 415 high schools throughout the state of Arkansas. And we taught them skills to build their own stories. And so the idea was, there's a lot of talk now in terms of VR. This is a new medium, like we don't know what's good or bad, but then everybody's talking about like, oh, do it for this thing, don't do it for this thing. So we wanted to be less prescriptive with that program and just like give the tools and skills to the students, and then just see what they built with it. I think the challenge with that type of work is that we sometimes run into like the technological or like digital skills needed to tell those stories. So we try to build some programming into it so that students of like various backgrounds could still build things, and then just look at what did they want to build, what were their stories like, as opposed to like being more prescriptive about this is what VR should or shouldn't be used for. Just like let them build the stories. And I can say out of that, there were a lot of toilet memes that came out of our group of high schoolers. So which was pretty funny. So,
and I feel, just to add to your point, right? I mean, when it comes to education, specifically in school education and so on, I guess teachers have a very strong hand again, in terms of how the final narrative should look like. Because, I mean, eventually, obviously, it's the teacher's responsibility to actually help a student learn better. And as a teacher, you would probably know much better in terms of what content could be, relevant to a particular set of students and so on, given you have context as well. So I guess, I mean, there's a strong role that I see for teachers playing in terms of content that comes out on VR for education.
yeah, and the tools aren't there yet. Unfortunately, I want to recommend something, but there isn't anything great yet where you can build your own stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we're talking about regulation as though we can regulate the whole market. You can regulate the educational content, but you still can't, regulate the commercial market, can you? So there's potential that all sorts of material will come out that could be dangerous or difficult for people to come across if they're too young or...
No, I guess you're right again. I mean, I think there is again a very strong need to have some regulation around the kind of content that's coming out. But as I said, I guess because we are not mainstream yet, we haven't actually gone to the point of actually thinking in that direction as yet. So again, I mean, our generation loves to actually look at things when they explode. So I'm guessing when this explosion happens someday, that's when all of these governments and societies will come to forth to start thinking on the lines of regulation. But today, as of today, if you ask me, at least I'm not aware. I don't think anybody is actually thinking in that direction, and there's a strong need to do that too, because we are just starting off, and it's always good to actually define your boundaries when you start, so you can actually make progress faster. So again, the need of the hour is to actually do that in combination with the content and experiences we're thinking about.
Okay. Right. Well, I think we're nearly out of time. So what I'd like to ask each one of you is teaching empathy a good thing, and how best to do it in a line or two. Elise.
I can start. I think it is a good thing. I also want to stress that the best way to do it is through what we call rational compassion, and through teaching ethics and thinking through the morality behind saying this is a good or a bad thing for a person or a species or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, short answer is yes. And I think in a sense it boils down to three very fundamental questions, right? I mean, it's basically why, what, and how. So I guess we have answers to why and how, because I mean, we just discussed that today, and how, again, the state of the art is improving. But what is still an open question, and that's something that, again, as a community, we need to get together and work on. What kind of content, what kind of experiences, and so on. So, I mean, again, short answer is yes, but again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done before we can actually go put that to forth in terms of real execution.
Yes, definitely. I think teaching empathy helps us connect to others. I don't think we need virtual reality to do that, but virtual reality can be used to supplement what already exists for people and their different options and the training that's available for them.
All right, would you like to give our panelists a round of applause? Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.